AWS identity risk at scale beyond CNAPP visibility. I'm James Casagrande. I'm here with Nathan Schmidt. We're both from Sunry Security, and we are excited to lead this discussion today. Real quick, Sunry Security, we're a cloud security vendor hyper-focused on identity and permissions risk and security. We've been doing it for a while now, and we're super excited to talk to you today about one of our favorite topics, which is CNAPP. CNAPP has been great. We love it. It's been an amazing revolution of new tooling that's come through the past few years. We've had sort of an initial wave of a bunch of great companies bringing some super awesome products to market that have given us a lot of vision into AWS specifically, but the entire public cloud. And we, as identity experts, kind of want to narrow in on what this has meant for identity risk and why we still seem to have a problem that reminds us of the old days in cloud security, where we have something seems a lot like alert fatigue or way too many tickets to still remediate. So we have this great new tool. Why aren't we getting through so many issues that we have despite our new prioritization capabilities? So we're going to talk through that, why identity is the way it is in cloud, options to tackle it, why it's super important, why we think it's even more important sometimes than some of your CVE remediation or patching that you're doing, and sustainable changes you can make, stuff that we've worked on to develop and bring to market around securing identity in AWS, and any other questions you have. Again, I'm James. I'm on the product team here at Sunry. Nathan is our cloud security catalyst. You may know him from poking the bear on LinkedIn. He's very passionate about issues in cloud security. And really, Nathan, thank you for joining me today.
Certainly. And I do poke the bear on LinkedIn, so I enjoy doing that.
That you do, yeah. All right, so set the scene. We've got the all-seeing CNAPP, right? And we've got a bunch of great dashboards that look something like this with a ton of information about risk in our cloud. But let's roll back the tape and see how we got here and take you back to, let's say 2020, which I would consider, maybe late CSPM days or post CSPM hype, where we had cloud security posture management, right? And we basically got tired of how many things it was throwing at us. So this concept of alert fatigue was really big back then, and we had a prioritization issue. Of course, a big thing was, public exposure of resources in the cloud, and CSPM was really big on doing, platform configurations that you might have missed in the cloud console and making sure, hey, that S3 bucket's not exposed. But it didn't have a good way of telling you which S3 bucket mattered more, right? And what really was going to be important for either compromising your cloud or exposing PHI or important, sensitive data. So we got really, us and a lot of other cloud security vendors said, we need better prioritization. And that's kind of where CNAPP came from. We took it together a bunch of other alphabet soup of cloud workload protection and CIEM and data protection, and said, let's take all this data and contextualize a risk and tell someone who's trying to secure AWS, hey, this risk matters because it's connected to a box that has a CVE above 9 on it. There's assume role chaining that can happen to a resource that we've tagged with a sensitive tag, and therefore the blast radius on this is huge, and you need to care about this risk more than this risk. And it wasn't just about how you could technically describe the risk of saying, oh, this is a really cool exploit or easy to find exploit, but it was about what it would mean to your cloud. And that was a really cool innovation, right? But now it's 2023, or now it's 2024, and we still seem to have a ton of issues piling up from the sort of the inheritor of CSPM, CNAPP, and we're not burning them down the way that we want to. So every dashboard seems to look like this, right? Where we've got about a bajillion tickets or whatever you guys call them, issues, alerts, what have you. And they are prioritized. We've got better prioritization now. We absolutely have made progress. But the research is a little scary in that 23 to 30% of all cloud security alerts are just ignored, and 41% of alerts that are defined as critical are being missed weekly. So again, a security vendor is not going to, there's no incentive for them to say, well, you've got 10,000 alerts, I'm going to normalize and, say this alert is actually less critical or less urgent than my algorithm says it should be, right? We're just going to keep piling up those alerts. So it's kind of an issue where we have to look at why this is happening, despite the great visibility that we're getting, right? So why is this particular to identity as well? And that's really where we narrow in on our expertise here. So you got to take it to the way identity is architected in the cloud. So cloud RBAC, right, is set up in a way that is necessarily going to encourage proliferation of principles of identities in the cloud. Now, these principles are not just people, right? They are mainly machine identities. And we need to think about this a little bit differently in cloud. This might be old hat for some of you, but again, in the data center world and the analogs that we use to sort of describe our infrastructure in cloud, identity is a bit of a misnomer, right? It's really a node that's part of the infrastructure, that's a means of access. And it's not connected to generally a person, right? And actually in the best architecture, right? It's not connected to people. You have some human users, but everyone's using roles, right? That are associated to functions and have policies attached to them. So we have a necessary, the way that the RBAC system is set up, or the way that you're supposed to architect RBAC in somewhere like AWS, is using the account structure like a security boundary and saying, okay, we've got a role that has this function. We're going to recreate that role in every account. And we're going to use things like cross-account trust and, assume role and all these things to access them. So where there was one role before, there might be 10 now, right? And even if you have a small AWS footprint, you know that you probably, unless you're doing things a little bit differently, you probably don't have one account. You probably have, probably utilizing AWS organizations and have a whole hierarchy of these things. So that's going to cause necessarily a proliferation, what a word, of principles in your cloud. And that in and of itself is going to make sure that there's always going to be a ton of issues if you're going to have more identities. If you're going to have identities in the tens of thousands, which, we've seen it in the hundreds of thousands in some of our accounts, or excuse me, some of our customers. So you've got that issue on one end. Then on the other side, you've got the cloud service providers, AWS, Azure, GCP, who are doing a great job responding to customers who want more services. We keep asking them, we want more functionality. We need a different service that does this. They've been really, really fast to market with a ton of services to the point where there's, 200 plus, 250 plus. I don't even know how many there are in AWS anymore. Well, guess what? With every one of those services, there's new permissions attached, new unique permissions with their own, unique policy language that goes into AWS, and that your security tools have to account for. It's something like 45,000 plus across the three major cloud providers, 45,000 plus unique permissions in the cloud today. Something like 17 per day, I think was the rate, at least it was in earlier this year, that they create new permissions, right? So again, on the customer generated infrastructure side, you've got all these incentives to build more and more roles. And then on the provider side, you've got all this incentive to build more and more services and therefore more and more permissions. So you've got complexity on both ends. Multiply those, and all of a sudden, you've got a huge identity footprint that you yourself probably never would thought of if I said the word identity, right? Now, the issue that's really stymieing us is this last bullet point about confused ownership. So because identity as a concept does not map the way people think it would map into cloud, there's oftentimes 1, 2, 3, 4 different teams who either think they're responsible or should think they're responsible and they don't. And it lends to a huge issue in determining where does the buck stop for people securing permissions in new workloads or in existing workloads. And Nathan, you work with our customers. I mean, you're in a ton of different clouds. You see a bunch of different attempts at this. I'm sure What
Indeed.
actually it seems like what's more fascinating is the collective action problem of like understanding who has a good system of actually understanding who is responsible for an identity.
Well, yeah, and I really like that you said, what you said about identity not just being about people, right? But because I think a lot of folks, when they hear the word identity from a security standpoint, they think, oh, you know what, that's not me, right? That's some other team. But really, when you think about the cloud, as you pointed out, this is the permissions are how the cloud actually works and how you actually interact with the services in those clouds, right? So when we think about how this can get confusing across the various departments, usually, like I just talked about, there's usually an IM team that's responsible for onboarding and offboarding people. There's a DevOps team that's responsible for getting their apps up and going as quickly as possible to make as much money on whatever app or apps that they're running. And then there's usually some team like a cloud ops team or something like that that's trying to come behind and is also responsible for making sure that those things are running, that they're not consuming too much money or overpopulating resources. And so you end up with this shared responsibility model, which I know a lot of people talk about, because in relationship to the cloud, that's important. But there's also this shared responsibility that happens relatively across all of these different departments. And so it gets really confusing, like who is actually responsible. So the thing that we see the most of, and certainly I have seen the most of, are situations where companies have grown to the point where they've had to grow fast. They're trying to do all these things right by getting the actual code and stuff rolled out into the components really well, but they still haven't figured out exactly. They're still, like, humans are messy.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so it's really easy for that messiness to also impact how where people get dropped off in roles. Should people be sharing certain types of roles, or are you just grouping everybody into one big bucket and handing them off to the cloud and telling them to have a good day? And I think that's where we see the most challenges in this.
Yeah. And to your point, right? If anybody, like, I want people to take away the fact that this is the result of people responding to rationally to incentives. And those teams, you laid out what their jobs are. And because they're pursuing their goals exactly the way you'd want them to, that's what then creates this issue. It's not because like, oh, we just did a bad job of cloud security, whatever. No, it's like this is literally what happens to almost every company. So you're not alone if this resonates. So
Absolutely not. And the problem of having permissions and when you're going to need them, I think there's always been this crisis between when should I give somebody the permissions? Do I need to wait? Do I need to wait until they can't do their job? Do I give
mhm.
them? And that's, like, it's a fundamental problem that manifests in a lot of different ways. So I think you're definitely right on that.
Yeah. So beyond that, human issue, right? And humans, as Nathan said, being the messiest part of the security chain. There's just this issue of scale, right? And I want to get to, the numbers just because people sometimes don't quite you throw out tens of thousands, whatever. But we've done research on this and there's pretty staggering numbers. So number one, remember I said about 45,000 unique permissions across the cloud service providers, 14,000 plus in AWS alone, right? We're focusing on AWS today, but a lot of these lessons can apply to Azure and GCP as well. 92% of identities have excessive permissions. That's companies big and small that we evaluated last year. 61% of the principals in those clouds are just fully unused for their entire lifetime. So that's a humongous amount of just identity and principal access floating around out there that's not really doing much. So if you give the fact that there's 10,000 average identities in a corporate cloud, okay, here's 6,000 identities that really are doing nothing except expanding your attack surface. So that's all well and good. Like, you can have, we know there's, cloud, there's detritus in the cloud, if you will. And there's plenty of stuff to clean up, and everybody always has stuff to clean up.
That's a
No one's
that's a
perfect.
25-cent word there, James.
Yeah, yeah, really. That's my English degree right there. Um, it's serving me really well. The issue that really where this comes into play is it's 30 minutes to on average to try and fix an unused identity. So even starting with the base case of let's get rid of these unused identities, it is such a burdensome activity to try and lock one of these down, because walk through the scenario in your head. Number one, you found your CNAPP tells you something's unused. Okay, where is it? Oh, it's in this account. Okay, who owns it? Who created it? How long has it been there? You can't answer that question, by the way, who created it, very easily in AWS. It's a little tough. There's a lot of log spelunking you have to do to get there. Then you have to answer the question of, if I get rid of it, will it break anything? And we know we don't want to do that, right? Nathan talked about earlier, those dev teams are incentivized to keep pushing workloads to production. It's the economic engine of the company, of the business, what they care about. So if you start plucking out, unused stuff and saying, well, this doesn't mean anything, but it turns out, it gets used once a month or once a quarter, what have you, or it's a break glass account, God forbid, then all of a sudden there's big issues, right?
The
So
risk of not making money exceeds the risk of potential security concern.
it's certainly, as far as the business is concerned, that's usually the
Absolutely.
case.
That is the maxim we run into all the time.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So this 30 minutes is really our issue, because we recommend starting there, right? We actually think this is the most interesting research we got from our customers and some other clouds. If you just took that base case, there's all these interesting stuff we can do with identity analytics. We can tell you really interesting lateral movement risks you have in your cloud, whatever. But just the base case that every CNAPP can tell you, which is this identity is unused, or this identity has unused permissions, just getting rid of them eliminates 55% of all the other CNAPP issues you have. So think about all of the things that are in CNAPP, right? All the risks. That's the whole point. It was a holistic, bringing all these things together, protecting your cloud all in one place. You kind of can just really clean it up by getting rid of these identities and these sensitive permissions. We'll talk about sensitive permissions in a second. And then 90% of all identity issues will be gone. So this is absolutely a good place to start. It's a worthy thing to try and delete those identities. But as we said, to go back a slide, right? 30 minutes to fix each one, 66,000 in each cloud are just unused, not even getting into the particulars of, who's using which permissions, but just fully unused. That's a hell of an investment of time for your team to try and go fix. So it seems like there's something else here. There's something fundamental that's creating these issues that needs to be cut off at the spigot, because there's just no team. I mean, Nathan, there's no one we know that's burning down these, actually executing this to the point where they're like, yeah, no, we have 5 alerts in our CNAPP because we quarantined everything.
I've been doing this for a long time. I think I could fill up maybe one hand. I might get into the other of organizations that have been good about cleaning up unused resources.
Mm,
And it
yeah.
really boils down to the fact that I think so if you go, let's talk about AWS for a second. So if you go and you've got your CNAPP tool has just said, hey, this role's never been used. And you go and you figure out, you take the time to go figure out who owns that role, and you figure it out relatively quickly, and you're like, hey, this thing's never been used. Can we delete it? Well, that was created by, Robert. Robert left the company about 9 months ago, and he created that as a part of this app that nobody really understands how to use, so we can't delete it. But it's sitting there with all these permissions. Why did Robert create the role? We don't know. It doesn't make sense to reach out to him. So what ends up happening is that you end up with these things sitting around that are, permission to do all these things, but nobody really knows what they do. Sometimes some of those are actually critical. And if you delete them, and when it comes time run that really infrequent thing because it's so infrequent, it's not top of mind, so nobody knows what to do, and it turns into a bigger thing. So there becomes this sort of existential crisis with deleting unused identity resources because they could be really important. And if and if you're lucky to be in one of the big percentage companies that doesn't have to worry about that, well, that's great. But
Right.
I guess the question is, what happens if you can't delete it, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's the issue for that scenario you laid out is the scenario for so many non-people NPI or machine identities, right? So and so many of them are overprivileged that the chain of ownership or creation, like you said, is just so broken or it's just non-existent. And there's really no way to determine whether or not they're important or not. But as you can see here, right, over half of them have sensitive permissions granted to them. So there isn't it's not like it's a just for fun, we're cleaning up because we like to run a tight ship. It's no, there's real risk here. And now just to define it, right? So sensitive permissions, as Sundry's using it, is basically a permission that can be used to achieve a MITRE attack tactic in the MITRE attack framework. So, exfiltration, infiltration, something like that. In
To
AWS,
seriously change your cloud to be able to do something that would make it a bad day.
yes, thank you. In AWS, the ratio I think is only about 2,500 of the 14,000 plus are sensitive, right? So we emphasize like, hey, focus on these because this is going to shrink that scale problem quite a bit. There's a lot of, security people never want to say this, but there are some, risks on certain permissions that are really not going to harm you and can be deprioritized. Um, Vendors never want to tell you that, right? Because they kind of want to. It's always a game of CYA, but
Yeah.
you need to be able to make that call. And as you see here in our research, over half the MPIs have sensitive permissions granted, and you saw how many are unused. So we have the issue where we can't delete them. So we need something that we can do some sort of quarantining or reversion of granting permissions back to assets, but not removing the assets. Because again, think of these identities. It's almost don't think of about identities. They're parts of the infrastructure. They're pieces of the Jenga puzzle that if you pull out might be fine, but it's a lot safer because of the information deficit we have and the scale we have to leave them in and just make sure they can't hurt you.
That's a
So
really
we
good
need
analogy.
something. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that's a really good analogy. I like the Jenga analogy.
Yeah. I hope the cloud is more stable than a, than a Jenga tower, but it can, I mean, breaches happen, so it can occur. So we need something that, again, reversion of permissions back and getting to a point where we can get past this point in time least privilege concept, right? Nathan, the cloud is dynamic. That's like a rote point, but it really does seem like when people try and or think in terms of least privilege, it's always, I think the term you say is in the rear view mirror. They're getting permissions, behind where they've already been. And
Right.
we're already advancing past that every day.
Yeah, and the challenge to that is that because there isn't an understanding of, is that important to understand? Absolutely. I mean, it's just in the function of understanding unused and what's being used and unused. While that is incredibly important, you can't drive by the rear view mirror, right? Is an important part of driving? Absolutely. We need that information to be able to make good decisions. But a big part of this too is that you but I think the real corollary to that and the thing that we need to lean on when we're talking about this is that when you talk about deleting those things, that is a much more difficult way of being able to get those things back. There are some other alternatives, which I think we'll talk about as we go through the course of the day. But how do we present a model that allows us to be able to protect those things? You talk about quarantining that. I love it because when you think about quarantining something, you're not taking off, you're just putting it in a fence. You're putting it in an airlock where it's not going to do anything until you let it. And I think that's a really important concept as we start thinking about how to deal with these unused permissions and even across unused identity resources in general.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to walk through that, right? And Nathan, I want you to take us through this because you live and breathe it. But people, we could, I don't want to throw out the 30-minute thing and say, hey, it takes 30 minutes to fix an unused identity and just have people take it for granted. I think it's worth walking through. This is actually what you have to do in AWS today, right? To eliminate these kinds of things. And as we talked about, it's not only a technical issue, it's a collective action and a human issue.
100%. And look, there's a lot of people are like, hey, you found this role that's never been used, or you found this permission on this policy that's not being used. But the problem is we say 30 minutes, but really that's an average.
Yeah.
It could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 3 hours, it
Mm.
could be a day, like or 2 business days, because you had to wait for somebody to get back in the office to tell you what's going on, and now that's sitting there for even longer. I mean, when you go through these steps and you're actually like, okay, what is this thing doing? Got to look at the logs to see, who created that. What is who when you get the identity, like, are they still around? Is this somebody that you can reach out? Who's their manager? Is it even still relevant? Um, when you ask them what does this role do, and nobody on the team knows, once if you finally get it, you can delete it. But up until that point, it's it's all of these steps leading to the coordinate the deletion that may also require Jira tickets or ServiceNow tickets, or
Right.
you have to get some sort of change control made because this is a in a production account or something along those lines where somebody's going to have to make a decision. So you could be using not only 30 minutes of your time, but think about all the teams that may need to be touched, and the level of knowledge and understanding it would take to actually get to the point where you're coordinating that deletion. And that's
Yeah.
where I think even the 30 minutes is a misnomer, because there are some that are going to be super simple. There's always going to be low hanging fruit, but then what do you do for the ones that aren't?
Very few of these steps are systems talking to systems or
Right.
technology. These are literally emails and
Yes.
meetings between people, right? And
MS Teams getting on, trying to figure out
yeah,
what's the next step. Yeah, totally.
exactly. No one likes this. And it's just fraught with it's the ability to just expand. So again, this is what you're up against. So that's why, we need to solve it. It's just becoming too big of an issue. These are some given initiatives, right? And nothing on here is good or bad, right? These are what I would call half measures that people try and use to address this issue. They all have problems. As always, there's a trade-off between, or as usual, I should say, there's a trade-off between, productivity, development productivity, and sort of the ability to implement and how easy it is and what have you. But just walking through these, right? So we have this issue of RBAC. RBAC proliferates everything. We need to be modern and move to ABAC. Um, I love that from a marketing perspective. I haven't met anybody that can do that. And quite frankly, ABAC isn't even enabled in all AWS services. So if you can do that, great. But other than that, until it gets somewhere else and it's beyond just some tagging stuff, I'm not really going to be recommending that to anybody, right? Seems like it's a little pie in the sky. Uh, could centralize policies? And what do I mean by this? I mean about leveraging in AWS service control policies, SCPs, and RCPs, which are brand new, if you've heard of them, resource control policies that are resource based. They're actually a super awesome initiative that let you handle third party access a little better. Um, yeah, these are things you absolutely can put in as guardrails, sort of to preempt the risk that is building up in your CNAPP. The issue is there's limits on this and they're really hard to manage, right? So you've got 5 SCPs you can write per account. They have character limits. You can use the organization hierarchy to sort of get around that, or just leverage, okay, this SCP has stuff in this OU that applies to all the accounts beneath it. But you need somebody who's an expert in policy logic and policy language, right? And we know, look, AWS IAM, it's not everyone's favorite. I get it. We live and breathe it, but it's not something that probably your team wants to deal with to this level. Also, they're extremely powerful. So you need to be careful with, you're not breaking anything, because SCPs in that policy logic evaluation do sort of supersede almost every other kind of policy, right? So a good option, but something that requires a little elbow grease. But it will, future-proof you, right? It will protect you from, sort of the proliferation of issues piling up in your CNAPP like we're seeing today. Shift left, right? Huge buzzword for the last 10, however many, more than that, years. Still important, still something you want to do. It's not your developer's job or it's not even your DevOps job, even though security is part of their day and they absolutely need to secure the templates that they're using in IAC and be compliant and all that. It's not their job to innovate around security. It's not their job to understand new risk. And it's really not something that, again, we're talking about people responding to incentives, that they're going to bear the brunt of the responsibility for understanding that, oh, identity is totally different in the cloud. And we have scale issues that are creating, kind of a new paradigm of the types of risks that we're seeing. So absolutely, shift left is part of any good security strategy. It is not going to solve the issues we saw earlier in here, where we have, thousands of unused identities and whatnot. That's that you can be, design security in with shift left, but you're not going to address the inevitable drift and, sort of the straying from perfect, right? From that is sort of promised by designing into IAC. Native tools, we're going to talk about this in a second. So cloud native tools like IAM Access Analyzer, absolutely something that we're gonna use. Issue is kind of brings up the same prioritization, a lot of issues that it will bring to you to edit policies at the IAM policies at every level. Absolutely something you should be using. We're going to talk about that on next slide. And then the other sort of final boss of security is, oh well, we'll get to zero trust and we'll use just in time. I'm hearing a lot about JIT these days. That's great. Zero trust and JIT do not work for thousands of machine identities. You can absolutely do better smart workflows. You can do smart approvals and automated approvals and speed things up. And you absolutely can use JIT for important production environments for your human users. But for machine identities, there is not really a way to implement this that does not grind dev productivity to a halt. So, Nathan, my read here is like these are all good initiatives, but you're gonna have to do something else basically to get past the issues that we're seeing today in identity and vis-a-vis CNAPP.
Absolutely. And I think I think one of the challenges too that comes up a lot, and I was just as I was hearing you talk through this, I was literally just thinking of this came to mind is that, you know, we when I think when a lot of folks started investing in CNAPP and started thinking about, oh, I have this tool that's showing me a lot of things about my cloud. It's giving me a lot of visibility. I'm able to see some of the CNAPP products offer you the ability to see some unused permissions, some unused identity resources. It's giving you the ability to see, okay, um, I'm able to see, and I'm kind of going to equate this with traffic safety. So bear with me as I switch into a little bit of an analogy here. But you've got this like traffic helicopter above that's seeing the traffic, and you're seeing all of these things happen. But what we're talking about here is, how can we do things better to prevent accidents or to prevent some of these things by changing some of the some of the signage. Do we need to make some fundamental like changes underneath the scenes? Like when we talk about shift left everything, you're talking about changing like whole exit lanes or something like that. It really does. You're looking at these different ways of being able to manage the traffic and the issues that are being created as a result of these issues happening. The reality is that everything that's happened so far has already created a situation where the people inside of your environment are creating situations that are creating risk. And once you get into CNAPP, now you're getting this tool and you're seeing that risk and understanding it, where the risk exists and sort of what the patterns of those things are. And there's always going to be these layered approaches for what you can do to try, what can you do more fundamentally? What can you do maybe more at the top level or at the people level to try and manage these things? But there's I think there's even a better way to do this, and I know what's on the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about more about that. But this is where I think where we really get into understanding this at scale. Is there something you wanted to lead off here? Because I have some ideas, but I wanted to see
No, no,
what you
we
thought
can
there.
jump right into it. I mean, we want to go past, right? So as Nathan said, there's we need to get past sort of the visibility, and visibility is great. We've got visibility. We see what's happening in our cloud, but we're not addressing remediation in any way that's sustainable. And again, these are not what we're going to get into here are not methods for getting better remediation, right? You can do that. You could absolutely, if there's cloud remediation tools that give you better workflows and ticket management and automation, go for it. That's great. That's not
Efficiency is good at any level.
exactly. Yeah, please. Yeah, please figure that out. Any more cloud security you can do is great. Um, that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about addressing the 10,000 tickets that you have. We're talking about why are there 10,000 tickets? And that's what we need to get into here. So we started a little buffet option of like, okay, where do we go from DIY, basically investment levels, DIY to dabbling in some cloud services, which for our purposes will be Access Analyzer, and then third-party tooling and things that what Sunry does. But for Nathan, I don't know how you want to kick this off, but I was going to talk about scripting and DIY and saying, maybe we can implement that quarantining idea, just with a few simple simple scripts, a little bit of, log interrogation to find things that are unused, and then, attaching deny all to some things. But we can start there, or we can,
Yeah.
what's your thoughts?
Well, look, there are some companies out there, some folks that are, look, they're super smart. They know where all of these problems are. They're seeing it in real time. It's like the matrix for them. They're already in there and knowing why this stuff is happening. But usually those people are also going to be the ones that are thinking, well, I can just script my way out of this. I can, if I just build this other tool that allows me this one thing, then that's going to change this element. But then they start walking down this path. It's a little more complicated. I mean, the reality is, like, if we just talk about AWS, the permission structure and the way that all of the SCPs and the RCPs and the permissions boundaries and all of these things work together, and the S3 bucket ACLs and all of these components, the methodology is, look, there's a really large like flow chart for how all of those things work. And
Yeah.
are there some easy paradigms? Yes. And there some people that have figured out how to script things to make it easier? And I'll tell you, the answer to that question is yes, but also that there are some of those folks that are now coming to Sonri because they realize that once they also build a script, now it requires maintenance, and AWS is constantly changing. So there are benefits in being able to maybe ease the pain now, and there may be some short arc stories there that you can certainly handle. But when you think about the medium to potential long-term issues of that, what happens if that person that created those scripts leaves the company and now they have a bunch of roles that do a bunch of things and nobody knows how those things work? That could be just as problematic.
Yeah, we end up adding to the problem, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some things we can do, right? I mean, this idea of quarantining, just to put a definition on it, right? So the way we see it is like there's AWS managed policy denial, right? You can attach that. You can, if you're watching this webinar, you probably know, or you can use Access Analyzer to do this, but you can go find out where your unused identities are, and you can attach that deny all to it. And you can effectively quarantine it, right? Like we said. So instead of deleting it, you just, take all the permissions away. And that will give you quarantine. What's the problem is the scenario we were laying out earlier, where we said, well, you don't know whether this thing means it is used, or it's a break glass, or it's an occasional, or it's, it has some function, but just hasn't been used yet. That still applies, because when somebody bumps up against that deny all, well, okay, this is, AWS policy orchestration here. Like, it's not going to, send them, you might get the right error code to the right person, but there's nobody handling that management of, oh, this was quarantined because it was, unused, click to use, or, send to a JIT, workflow or something like that. So as Nathan said, it's an ongoing issue where you can kind of get that point in time security, but things keep changing in the cloud, man. So it's such a tough job to ask someone on your team to manage this stuff day to day. So,
Well, and two, the notion of, look, Access Analyzer is a necessary tool.
100%.
You do need to understand who and what has the ability to do what inside of your cloud. That the need for that is never ending. And so using something like Access Analyzer is a great, I like to say it's a great first step, right? Using CNAPP is an incredible first step. Being able to figure out what vulnerabilities you need to access and associate it with risk, and being able to correlate that across all of those things. Those are all really important. But there's a way, but what you're always doing in that scenario is you're playing whack-a-mole. You're getting better at figuring out more quickly where the mole is to whack, but you're still having to do that one by one.
Right.
And the risk of that is that, there on the slide a few back, you were saying, 55% of these things create like these issues, and 41% of the riskiest items were stacking week over week. That means you have 41% growth in the number of issues that are occurring in your environment. I mean,
Yeah.
that is an unsustainable number.
Yeah.
That's
It
not
gets
good.
very silly very quickly, which is part of the problem, because I put up these, and if you do the math, you're like, it just gets to a silly number, and you're like, eyes glaze over, they're just like,
That's
okay, what
right.
do you want me to do with that? It's a mountain. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so I think that's where a lot of people are left, and they're still sort of at this, at the chasm of, how do I wrap my arms around this problem, this
Yeah.
immense, this thing. And that's where I think Sonri gets into, I talk about the other things like Access Analyzer is a great first step. CNAPP's a great first step in being able to understand the problems of your cloud, but there needs to be something before that. And I think that's where Sonri gets into the step zero side of things.
Yeah, I like that. You need a step zero. So Access Analyzer, right? Again, great tool. For those of you who don't know it, assuming if you're watching this webinar, you're pretty familiar with it, but you do need to opt in and turn on the analyzers, right? And you can choose to have analyzers on individual assets, or you can, put them. I think now they have a more blanket option where you can deploy it even at the org level. It might be more costly that way. You do pay per analyzer and what have you, but it's going to give you that baseline concept of least privilege, where it's going to say, hey, this role has a policy attached to it, and that policy has these permissions, and over the time period you asked me to monitor it, it didn't use them. Do you want to go edit that policy and take those away? And that's great, right? That's really important information to have. But to Nathan's point, think about the scale we're dealing with. So if you're at 61,000 or 6,000 out of 10,000 identities that are unused, or all the sensitive permission considerations, you're playing whack-a-mole, like you said. So the iterations are the same. So you've got better data, but you still are doing the same amount of work. So that's really, and then, oh, by the way, right? We run into that same collective action issue of, well, does anyone know if it needed this permission or not, right? And then we're back to our steps of doing some coordination over Teams or Zoom or what have you to figure out whether we can remove these permissions. So yeah, that's where we get into this third-party tooling like Sunry. Nathan's step 0, which I like, which is let's take that concept of, those central guardrails that we were talking about earlier. So things like SCPs, and can we make it so that those are manageable and act and implemented in a way that is managed, so is going to continue to be, reducing risk in tomorrow's cloud in the same way it's doing in today's cloud, but then also, not just running into and not running the risk of breaking stuff that a powerful tool like an SCP might do. I mean, we have a lot of stories of people that have come to us and saying, look, we tried to manage SCPs. We ended up basically blowing something up in production and somebody got very mad at us, right? And therefore now we need somebody to do it for us. So that's kind of this preemptive sort of step you're talking about, Nathan. And it's is the thing we're trying to tell people to do. Again, not addressing remediation, but addressing the cause of the remediation. And I
That's
think
right.
that's what, yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's key. And I was actually just running a number off to the side here. I was like, in a 40-hour work week, if it took 30 minutes, how many unused identity resources could you effectively go out and delete on average? And it turns out to be about 80. And I just thought that was really interesting. But to your point very specifically, when we start thinking about visibility and remediation, again, those are all situations where we are the conventional wisdom of cybersecurity for the cloud has always been about um, you are effectively looking to get as much visibility in you can as to what has happened and then try to react as quickly as possible. And the only areas that you have to be able to try and narrow that field are around identity people resources. So like your Okta, your pings, your Entra IDs, and those sorts of things, which are granting access to, in AWS's case, a role inside of AWS, or you may be using, some sort of Terraform or some sort of Git solution that's rolling out roles to your cloud. But in either of those situations, you're defining those things. But if anything happens unexpectedly, and we talked earlier that there are all of these departments that are responsible for certain security elements across these things,
Mm.
there is an opportunity for there to be unexpected outcomes in the intersections of all of that movement. And so, being able to do that without deleting stuff, without changing your permissions, sometimes it's almost easier to explain what Sonri is by what it isn't. But yeah, ultimately, what Sonri does as a big part of this is we become the step 0 by being able to take those things off the table. If y- y- there are these technologies in cars. I'm going to go back to the traffic safety thing, where if the car if it alerts you when you turn on your signal and you go to change lanes and there's a car there that was in your blind spot, and it prevents you from immediately turning the wheel and says, whoa, there's a car, that is an active thing where now in that particular case it's actually taking control of the car in that brief instance, so you're not taking you're not hitting that car. But that is an example of how a preventative action could prevent an unexpected issue, something that you weren't seeing that was in your blind spot, that can make it a really bad day for you. And I think that's really where we get into when we start talking about Sonri here.
Definitely. And yeah, the Sunry is, we think we do a good job of an aspect of this. There's also, like we said, there's roles for JIT tools and other workflow-based tools for human identities in important production environments and things like that. But again, the machine identities that comprise the majority of your cloud, and again, not thinking them as identities, but as just nodes of infrastructure that are, basically access, right? Means of
Yep.
access. How, as Nathan says, permissions are how the cloud actually runs. So if permissions are how the cloud runs and identities are, how permissions, get get access essentially. And thinking of it that way, that's what we try to address. And that issue of, it's really And we're going to get into, other ways you can do it without Sunray. And I think we should talk about SCPs and what have you. And by the way, on our website, we talk a lot about SCPs because they're super powerful. We've got 5 free SCPs on our website. You should go download. They're basically just really good, sort of universal policies, for a couple different, sort of applicable use cases that we really like around identity security. Um, but when it comes to, how do we solve this biggest chunk of the identity risk, which is these machine identities that are unused, don't have, and, have sensitive permissions on them? We think it's through this process, right? So we have to be able to, number one, understand what sensitive permissions are. We need to understand things that are unused and just start there. And then we need to be able to deploy, something via a central control like an SCP in a way that is not going to run up against the issues that people have traditionally had trying to manage those things themselves. So taking care of the policy orchestration of all those levels, taking care of the writing of the SCPs, right? And the policy logic and language, I should say, right? So you don't need that expertise, sort of taking that away and putting that into a security product and saying, hey, we got this. And that concept of quarantining. So we're not going to remove things that are part of the cloud infrastructure, but simply quarantine them, but then have a methodology for getting them reactivated. So that issue, again, of what we said of the scripting scenario where you could quarantine it, that's great. But then if it needs reactivation, what happens? You need something that looks like some sort of approval or automation around getting a workflow into getting that reactivated, right? And those are the types of things that Sunray does that we think takes this process way down when it comes to trying to do what Nathan was describing when he got to, 80 a week he could get through. Um, we think with this central control, uh, sort of step zero, as Nathan said, we think you can do it a lot faster. And then all of a sudden you go back to your CNAPP and you look and you say, you know what? Just as we said before, 55% of these issues are gone because I took care of the identities and I was able to quarantine them, the unused identities. I was able to quarantine them confidently because I know I can give the permissions back. And there's an audit of and management and record of why they're quarantined, and it's easy to sort of reactivate them. So that's the gap we're trying to fill, because we just don't think anybody can get through 10,000 issues that are critical and urgent. And I think it's a fair, it's unfair sort of what's happened to anybody who's responsible for cloud security. So it's up to vendors like us to sort of rectify that and not get into that cycle again, like we did with CSPM about, okay, here's a bunch more alerts. We did our job, now you got to go do it. So that's really what we're focusing on here.
I was
Um,
actually at a CSA event and was talking to somebody that was responsible for managing and really automating the outputs of their CNAPP tool. And I asked her what, you know, would she find a tool that would eliminate, some of those things that, that was never going to go away. You were absolutely going to still need to do those things. But if that could be reduced, would that make her happy, or would that make her feel like her job was at risk in some way? And she was like, oh my God, if I had the opportunity to be able to reduce the amount of alerts, I would choose that in a heartbeat. So I think
Absolutely.
that's something that a lot of people share.
Yeah, we know people don't like this. They don't like the big red number that they're looking
Yeah.
at. So look, we'll put the trial up here. We don't, we're not going to get into product or anything today. We want to get to some questions, talk more about CNAPP, talk more about what we can do to fix things. But if you are interested in anything we're talking about, we do a 14-day free trial. We do have those SCPs you should check out. We have SCP workshops on writing them and how they work. We do think this centralized control, whether it's Sunry or whether it's your own DIY, we think is the way to go to start getting these issues down, because we're just, there's just no way to burn down that big list we're seeing. So, again, it's easy. You can go to sunry.com/free trial. It's there. But let's talk about, a couple questions we've gotten, Nathan, and dive into some topics that are sort
I
of
think
floating
we have time
around.
for a couple questions.
Yeah, just a few. Um, so first one, CNAPP world. Okay, this is perfect. Prioritization. Identity is kind of the third horse in the race. There's CVEs. My first priority is CVEs. My second priority is, IAC scanning security and like, whatever that means. How can it be more important than, how can this be more important than patching a high rated CVE?
Well, I'm going to go back and lean on the statement that I said before. I mean, all of that stuff is incredibly important, right? Your vulnerabilities that are happening on your in your code that you're deploying, vulnerabilities that are on containers or VMs or whatever OS infrastructure you're running, all of those things are absolutely important and critical. But the but if you're running that in a public cloud like AWS, only AWS controls permissions in AWS. So at the end of the day, if somebody has the permissions to come in and snapshot your VM and exfiltrate the data, or they have the ability to turn off EKS inside of your AWS, or they have the ability to redirect all of the network traffic in your VPC because they got the permissions to update your the way that your VPC works. Does any of those things matter? There's like a hierarchy of needs, like from a security element. And that's why I say Sonri is a step zero, because all of those things that you're talking about are incredibly important. And those have been with us, time immemorial in cybersecurity.
Mhm.
But when it comes to the cloud, there is, it wasn't just a lift and shift. There is now another security element in there that does require attention, and it's more than just people. And because I think for a long time it used the word identity, people were like, because identity historically was not something that security people directly dealt with, that was what people dealt with people coming on and off employment, not as a function of the cloud. And while that has changed over time, the issue is still very prevalent, and it's still very early in its stages of how to deal with it. And we were one of the ones that felt, well, if we just give you a list of all the problems, you can go fix it and then figure out how to perfect it. But perfection is not a real capability. It is about dealing with the unexpected events and being able to, potentially put a human being in there to make the difference between, maybe a slight inconvenience for the people, between that or a bad day. And I
Right.
think that's the big difference.
Totally. Oh, great answer. Next question is, all right, so okay, I keep talking about centralization. So you're in favor of centralization, and it seems like juxtaposing it with, or opposing it with shift left, right? And
Okay.
so I'm wary of it because I have a small team. I can't handle a ton of remediation. I want to shift left and get my developers to care about security. That's the only way to get these issues resolved. Happy to be proven wrong. All right, so this is a common thing we've sort of heard. Again, shift left is not bad, right? But there's a way you can sort of do both. But yeah, I'll let you take it away.
Um, so actually, can you repeat the question again one more time? I just want to make
Sure.
sure there was
Yeah.
something in there that I heard, and I want to make
So
sure I
yeah,
heard
the
it right.
concern is you're in favor of centralization, which I think is implying, and the person saying, I have a small team. I can't handle a ton of remediation. So when we say centralization, it kind of sounds like in security terms, I totally get it. Oh, we're bringing it back to, there's a SOC, or there's three guys who are going to have to now, take care of all the things that used to be taken care of at the DevOps level or at the development level. And if you centralize, you're not democratizing or whatever, so how are we going to be able to handle that volume of issues that are now going to come to us? And I think
I
we need
got you.
centralization a little bit differently than that.
Yeah, and I think we do too as well. And thank you for replaying that back for me.
Mhm,
Um, Look, I think at the end of the day, I think that the challenge is that there's a belief that if I'm not dealing with it automatically, either up front in the code that I'm rolling out, then I'm going to say, okay, this is going to roll out in a very particular way. I'm going to create these rules. These rules are going to define how I'm going to roll this out. And therefore, I don't get a problem because I'm defining the rules that I'm rolling it out to, and nobody can question those after they after they roll out, right? Because if you're defining what the roles should be for the thing that you're rolling out that you've shifted left for, then you're not going to get questioned from a risk perspective because it appears to be that's what you were expecting, right? But
mhm,
then it gets to those things where even then, after those points, that's actually one of the big challenges that I think happens in a lot of organizations. Number one is that these things roll out, and like if it's a DevOps team that has been doing this and they get questioned about, well, why is this role still here? And they're like, well, I need it, nobody's touching it. Take it from me, only Terraform has access to this, and therefore it can't be a problem. Um, but but it has been shown time and time again that that isn't always the case. There are even unexpected things that can happen between as you're setting up cross-account trust relationships or trust relationships between roles that can potentially jump accounts. These are things that can get added along the line that could be alerted from a risky perspective, but the DevOps team may not want to hear it because they think it might be too much work. And I understand that, but like if you're using something like Sonnery where you have a defined workflow and you're setting these ground rules up, you actually shouldn't be getting a lot of different um it does not require a full-time employee to deal with those things because you really should only if the thing is truly unused and you're quarantining it as a zombie, then it shouldn't be coming back, right? And if it does, that's going to give you the opportunity to say, hey, is this somebody doing a maintenance using a role that they shouldn't? And it would have made us a bad day or a bad week if they did, or is this an indicator of compromise? So that's one piece of that puzzle. And then the second piece of that puzzle is with the permissions on demand to the access the sensitive permissions, or a workflow similar to that, you wouldn't you shouldn't be getting a lot of those because really, unless you're rolling out a new build, which there is a process for this,
mhm.
you shouldn't be getting a lot of requests for access to the most sensitive permissions of the cloud that are creating, updating, and modifying, the things, the way that your cloud is running. Because really, if it's an admin or a break glass role, those can be exceptions to the rule. Those can be part of the default allow list, and they do whatever they need to do. So there are other ways to think about that and other ways to do it, but there are challenges too that they may not be thinking about in the ways that they're already doing it.
Definitely. Thank you for that. All right. So in summary, guys, it's on the side here, but we need to address this issue. We love the innovation of CNAPP, but we need to get to the bottom of why we're not burning down this risk the way that we thought we would. And we do think big problem is human, it's organizational, who owns what, figuring out how we can delete stuff. If we can't, we need to quarantine it. How do we do that? And we need a way to do it in bulk, right? We can't just say we're going to fix 10,000 issues by hiring 10,000 people. So that if you could take something away from this today, it's think about identity differently. Identity might not mean what you think it means, and start thinking about the preemptive as Nathan said, the step zero of before that alert gets to CNAPP, right? CNAPP should be visibility absolutely into the risk of your cloud, but it's after you've set some central guardrails to make sure your identities are not run amok. So anyway, that's it for us. Nathan, thank you so much. Really
No,
appreciate
thank
it.
you for having me.
Of course, anytime. Love chatting with you. That's our LinkedIn if you want to click it and hear get yelled at by Nathan on Fridays when he's feeling spicy. He